Welcome all. Bill Lougheed here, Executive Director of the Georgian Bay Land Trust. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today for our fourth 2020 LandMark Speakers event. We're delighted to have eminent researcher Professor Ryan Norris with us here today, but before introducing Dr. Norris, I'd like to thank each of you for tuning in today and thank each of you for your support of GBLT's work on Georgian Bay. Your support is really, really important. And although these are challenging times, this pandemic has perhaps reminded us of certain important things such as family, community, relationships, and especially the outdoors. I believe it shone a spotlight on where our food comes from and the importance of nature in supplying that, and that in these uncertain times, wild places such as Georgian Bay remain unaffected. And that will continue as long as we look after our special place. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors of this series, Mark Payne and Payne Marine. Payne Marine has been serving the Portal Barrel area since 1961 and is a supplier of Yamaha outboards and Scott Hunt and limestone boats. And I hope you'll visit their site at paynemarine.com. I also want to take a moment to let you know that your commitment to conservation as GBLT supporters make an impact not just today, but for future generations. Just let's take a look back to 2019, where we protected 4 new conservation reserves and over 7,300 acres where species at risk roam at large and without peril. We also are launching in 2020 3 new conservation reserves, including a 290-acre reserve on Rose Island, which will be open to the public and open for educational purposes for youth and all ages. Last year, we also launched a partnership with Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve and 2 First Nations. This is a 4-year collaborative federal grant of $1.9 million to help preserve species at risk on our eastern coast. GBLT's involvement will involve setting up a Modus tower arrays to protect migratory birds on our coast and better understand their nesting and breeding habitats and preserve those habitats. We're also the lead on mapping new areas for species at risk and allowing all participants in Georgian Bay better understand what a special place this is through integrative GPS mapping. So now I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Ryan Norris, professor at the University of Guelph in integrative biology and the Weston Family senior scientist since 2019, serving for their Nature Conservancy of Canada. Ryan is a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology, and his research studies and models the behavior, population dynamics, and ecology and conservation of migratory and resident animals living in highly seasonal environments. His internationally recognized work has an emphasis on migratory birds and butterflies, and his migration studies on the monarch butterfly, including groundbreaking isotope work, has helped save the monarch through informing conservation action in a very short turnaround period of time. Ryan received a university research chair in 2019, and in 2019 began a cross-appointed position as Weston Family senior scientist, where he leads studies and a fellows program that will further the protection of biodiversity in Canada. So I'm delighted to turn it over to you now, Ryan, for what I know will be a most interesting presentation. Thank you, Ryan.
Well, thanks, Bill. Let me just share my screen here. Am I good? Well, okay, this is the first public talk I've given in this format, so it's unusual, and I hope everybody can hear me all right. Feel free to insert comments as I go, and we can get to them. I'm happy to answer them after the talk. Thanks for the introduction, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be involved with Georgian Bay Land Trust. I've given a couple talks in the last few years for this group, and I'm happy to keep doing it and happy to keep involved. Georgian Bay Land Trust has been supportive of our work on nightjars in the Torrance Barrens Dark Sky Preserve, and I really appreciate that. As Bill mentioned, most of my work in the past has been focused on migratory birds, a variety of species, and migratory butterflies, mostly the monarch. And one of the biggest challenges in work on migratory birds, of course, is that and butterflies is, of course, they fly long distances. And so some of that work has been focused on tracking those individuals and trying to understand where breeding populations winter and how they're connected, and how the seasons are connected to influence individual success and population dynamics. But about 12 years ago, I started to get involved in a bird that doesn't go anywhere, stays its resident year round. And that's, of course, the Canada jay. And they're quite a remarkable bird, in many ways, much more remarkable than the birds that travel tens of thousands of kilometers each year. This, the work that I got involved with is a long-term study. And a lot of this work that I'm going to present today is benefits from those years of work. And the study was actually started the study was actually started in the early 60s. So what I want to talk about today, really, my outline's simple. I want to give you a brief overview of the Canada jays, and I'm going to do that in the context of the annual cycle. What jays do in different parts of the year and how they cope with different conditions. And then the second half of my talk, I want to talk about the causes of decline and where we study them in Algonquin Park. So to give you a bit of a context, jays live in the boreal forest from east to west, from Alaska all the way to Newfoundland, as far south as Arizona and New Mexico in the subalpine boreal forest. So they're really scattered, quite abundant. They're not listed as threatened or endangered. They're quite abundant. They go right up to the tree line. Where we have been studying them and since the late 60s is in Algonquin Park, which, as you can see there, is at the southern edge of their range in the eastern part of North America. And really they face kind of, as I'm going to talk about, they face unique challenges being in the southern part of the range here. This is really, literally, if you go south of Algonquin Park, you will not find gray jays. And the study in 1967 was started by a man by the name of Russ Rudder, who was a park naturalist. And he really started this study not knowing anything about gray jays, started to band a few jays and found some nests in a fairly small portion of the park. And in the early 70s, Dan Strickland, who's on the right there, took over the study. He became the chief park naturalist of Algonquin. He had done his master's on gray jays in Quebec a few years earlier, and he continued the study right up until present. I've been collaborating with him since 2009. And so this is, constitutes one of the longest running studies of any animal in Canada, really. And I've put a picture there in the bottom left of the screen showing how data were recorded for quite a long time on hard copy sheets, and then later transferred to different computer systems, and now running on present computer systems and programs. But of course, there's challenges with transferring those data and managing those data and stuff. And Dan Strickland has been doing an amazing job, and he's been quite a collaborator for me, and really the driver in a lot of this research. I'm going to start talking about gray jays. I'm going to use this graph. I'm going to come back to it. Talking about the annual cycle and ecology of gray jays. I'm going to start in the green portion, which I've labeled here as caching. So we'll start around now, August, September. What are Canada jays, excuse me, doing at this time? Well, really the whole annual cycle of Canada jays revolves around caching in some form or another, most of the annual cycle. And they cache not what you would think. They cache perishable food items, so anything really but nuts. They will eat meat from carcasses. They will capture small mammals. They'll cache mushrooms. They'll cache insects, berries as well. And of course, as most of you know, they're happy to take handouts in the right part of the year from people in Algonquin Park. Those are mostly visitors that come to the park. So they'll cache this food in the late summer and fall for, of course, later use during the winter months. And they don't cache food in a central place. Rather, they're what we call scatter hoarders. They cache small amounts of food that they fit in their bill in the bark of trees and on tree branches and lichen. And I put a little red arrow there on the right-hand side picture to show that where they might cache a small piece of food. Their territories are quite large. We've estimated them to be about 140 hectares for a single breeding pair in Algonquin Park. So they're caching their food across their entire territory. Quite a lot of food. Jays have been estimated to cache about 1,000. They could cache 1,000 or more food items in a single day. Of course, they have to remember where at least some of that cache is, some or all of those caches are several months later when they retrieve them in the winter. Also in the fall and into the winter, we capture jays in the park, and this has been going on since about the early 70s. We capture them. It's fairly easy to capture a jay the first time around with a walk-in trap that's baited. And when we capture them, we do measurements, standard measurements to estimate body size and condition. And we also attach colored leg bands to them, a unique combination of colored leg bands, so we can individually identify each jay within the study site in Algonquin Park. For some studies, we'll try to recapture them if we need another sample. But that proves to be fairly difficult because they're quite wise to trying to be captured a second or a third time. We do a fall census every year, so we go visit the territories in October and catch up with breeders and understand what they're doing, whether they have any young with them in October. In the winter, jays often look like this. They are sitting around, not actively foraging because there's seemingly little to no fresh food available. They're quite content. They remind me of often going down to the tropics and seeing, tropical birds hanging out. Not especially for Canada jays, especially in storms, they're fluffed up, and they're quite content. They presumably know where they've cached their food. They know where it is. They know when they need it. And so even under conditions like you see in the picture on the bottom, they're perfectly happy. I had at the beginning when I started studying Canada jays with Dan, I had a long-running debate with him about what period of the year jays might survive best. And I thought kind of naturally that they would have higher survival in the summer. But Dan insisted it was the winter that they would have higher survival. And sure enough, we did the analysis. And in both juveniles and first-year birds and adults, the birds that would be 2 years or older, they have higher survival in the fall and winter compared to the spring and summer. So these birds are they're in their element in the winter, and they're perfectly happy. There's fewer predators around, and they normally have a good food supply. So you'll notice if we move from the caching period into kind of the red zone, which I've labeled breeding, you'll notice that that red zone overlaps with the blue translucent period. And I haven't labeled that on purpose, but it is, what it is a period where they retrieve their caches, where they rely on the caches. And you'll notice that it overlaps with the breeding period, which is quite fascinating. The other thing that's unusual here is where that red bar is for breeding. Most birds, the vast majority of birds, will start breeding in late May and into June, whereas Canada jays start building nests in mid-February, in the dead of winter. And so these are scenes that we could probably get every year. This is on the top left, and the top right are females incubating on nests. In the top right picture, you can see just the tail of the female tucked under a tree there, nicely, some nice shelter above her. On the left, top left, is a female, a picture taken a long time ago by Dan Strickland, but a female incubating eggs in a snowstorm. And this is not unusual. We can get that picture every year. They lay normally 3 eggs, sometimes 4. And females incubate the eggs for quite a long time, about 22 days. And they rarely get off the nest to feed. When they do, they presumably go and get a load of cached food. Now, on our study site, we find all of the nests of the territories that we are, and individuals that we are monitoring. How do we do that? Well, we give jays nest material, as Dan found out a long time ago that this was an effective way to find a nest. This was something myself, working on other species, was not used to, because most species won't take nest material from people who put it out. But if you put out some cotton, jays, if they're nesting, are happy to take it. And they take it, and if sometimes they store it nearby, but often they'll take it directly to a nest. And it might sound easy, but when you've kind of given a jay some nest material on the other side of 140 hectare territory, and you've got to chase it in snowshoes to try to find the nest. And sometimes it's a kind of an iterative process to try to find the nest. You catch up with the jay again, maybe give it some more material. If we're really desperate and we're at kind of the end of the nest building stage, we might give them feathers. And the feathers they use to line the nest, we might give them some grouse feathers. They might cache those grouse feathers, as you can see on the top right picture there, much like they do caching food in the bark of trees, and then later get it and then deposit it in the nest. So we're often chasing jays in environments like you see at the bottom right there, deep snow, trying to find fairly often well-hidden nests in conifer trees. Lots of fun, and everybody involved in the project, everybody in my lab and Dan always have fun at this time of year trying to find nests. Once we find them, we monitor them and visit them regularly to determine when females start laying, or estimate when females start laying, and whether those nests are successful or not. They only, if they have a successful nest, they will not re-nest again. They're not double brooded. But if they have a nest that fails, if there's still enough time, they will re-nest again. As I said, we track them in a variety of ways. Snowshoes, sometimes snowmobiles if they're far off from the main highway, often crossing rivers that may or may not be frozen, and catching up with the birds. it's really, it's kind of a magical time of year, really. I've never searched for bird nests in the winter before I started this project. There's really, the landscape, of course, is very quiet, and it's really a nice time to be outside working on birds. One of the questions that we wanted to ask was, and I'm going to show a few graphs here and there. One of the questions we wanted to ask was, how do females do it? They incubate in sub-zero temperatures. We know they get off the nest to acquire cache food, but they don't do it frequently, maybe a couple times a day. And so we were interested in kind of what condition the females were required to get into before they started incubating. So we ran this very high-tech experiment in which we put a piece of cheese on a Tupperware and then a Tupperware on a weight scale. And then we videotaped it. And we could tear, of course, we could tear the cheese in the Tupperware and measure the weight of the jay. The jays were perfectly happy to land on the Tupperware and peck at the cheese and take the cheese away. And that allowed us to get weights. And if we did this every day, we would be able to understand changes in weight of females prior to nesting. And so here's some of those data. On the bottom axis there, the x-axis, we have days before a female lays her first egg. So we have the male and the female together on the graph, as you can see, and on the vertical axis is the weight. And you can see 10 or more days before the female starts laying, males are almost always heavier. Males will weigh on average 74 grams and females 67. But then something remarkable happens as we approach a female laying her first egg, in that she climbs and surpasses her partner in weight, and until just before. And she does this because she needs that extra fat to get through the incubation period. And she's doing this by retrieving more cached food, possibly better cached food, we don't know, in the middle of winter in February, March, which is quite remarkable. The rate at which they acquire cached food can influence their reproductive success as well. So that provided a little bit of insight about how jays get through the winter and how females are able to nest in February and March. We also wanted to know whether Canada jays were limited by food during the winter, during the breeding period. So what we did was a food supplementation experiment a few years ago. My grad student, Rachel Derbyshire, was lead on this project. And what she did was make cages that contained food inside, cat food, and put RFID readers in there, radio frequency identification tags, that once we put the detector on the color band of the jay, we could know who was going in and out of the feeder. And we could confirm that the females on certain territories where we put the feeders were using the feeder quite frequently. And sure enough, and in the supplemented territories, we found that females laid earlier than non-supplemented territories, and they had larger brood sizes as well in supplemented territories. So it seemed like, while jays survive fairly well in the winter, they are limited somewhat in food, and if you give them more food, they tend to start nesting earlier, and they raise more young. We wanted to use the long-term data set to ask this question too, and it's convenient that some of our territories overlap with areas that are frequently visited by people. And those people tend to supplement jays quite frequently. As you can see here, jay landing on somebody's camera. And so people bring food to jays and feed them. And so we're kind of interested, would we see the same patterns here? And it's great to see park visitors kind of connect with the winter boreal forest through Canada jays. Certainly, this is a picture of my daughter when she was 2. She's now 7, feeding her favorite Canada jay on a territory that she loved to visit every winter. And this is a 16-year-old Canada jay. I think at the time he's now died, which much to my chagrin of my daughter, she's got to find a new favorite Canada jay now. And what we found was that on territories that were frequently supplemented by park visitors showed the same patterns. Jays tended to nest earlier in the season and have a larger brood size, which means more young. And that timing is important because kind of counterintuitively, the earlier jays nest, the better they seem to do. This shows how lay date can influence the nest success. So earlier layers tend to have higher nest success. And they tend to recruit more juveniles, which means that more of their juveniles end up in the breeding population in later years. So nesting early is good, despite the fact that conditions are presumably harsher, colder. Nesting early gives you an advantage. So I want to move then now from the nesting period to what happens when the young fledge the nest. And this is a kind of another very interesting story that Dan Strickland uncovered over several years of observations. We typically have, access nests at around day 11 of the nestling period when they're 11 days old. And often at that point, the conditions have changed from winter to spring, which offer its own challenges to getting to nests, whereas previously we could have walked, snowshoed on rivers or lakes. We now have to break out the canoes. And to get to the nest, we often have to break out ladders and climb fairly high heights to get to them, to access them. When I first started working with Dan, I asked him how he got to the really high nests. And he told me that sometimes that if it was above ladder height, that he would build planks that he would painstakingly nail to 2 trees and make his own ladder. And this is what this right-hand picture is showing here. And I'll highlight can't really see it, but I'll highlight the ladder he has made above the homemade ladder to access the nest, which is at the top of the tree on the left-hand side there. And I'm not a fan of heights, and I'm also not a fan of putting graduate students in danger like this. So I thought Dan was crazy to do this. And so I said to Dan, okay, well, we're going to hire a tree climber to do this. We're not going to cache a bunch of wood in different places in the forest and in the park and do this, take a few days to do this. We'll just hire a tree climber. So any nests that were above a standard ladder height, we recruited a professional to access those nests. This is on the left-hand side. This is showing Phil Pavey accessing a nest there. And I think there was only one time where we had to actually haul the tree climber up with people, and that's showing that we're hauling them on the bottom right there, hauling that individual up with their very isolated tree. But otherwise, Phil has over the years done it himself and got to those nests. And what he does when he gets up there is he puts the nestlings in a little bucket and lowers them down to us, down on the ground, and we process them. We measure nestlings, and we put bands on them like we do adults. We might take a little blood sample to determine sex of the nestlings. And then once we're done, Phil hauls them back up in the bucket and puts them back in the nest. So sometimes Phil's up there waiting for us to finish. I've often seen him take work calls up there. while he's waiting for us, and he has a great time doing it. Of course, this puts alleviates a burden on us accessing nests and hauling ladders and other things into the forest, often in May, in April and May. So what happens when those young fledge the nest, if they're successful, is that for about 2 months, they're fed by their parents out of the nest. And of course, this is advantageous once nestlings are somewhat mobile. They have a better chance of escaping predators. But as Dan discovered, something very interesting happens. The nests, the fledglings, the newly fledged young, as they become independent, start fighting with each other. And one individual, the victor, gets to stay with its parents the remainder of the year. The other two are evicted. And excuse me, the other two are evicted. The juvenile that gets to stay on the breeding territory starts to actively cache food itself. The breeders, their parents, do not feed the juvenile directly during the fall and winter, but presumably it enjoys some advantage of being on its parents' territory. Now, once the parents nest again the following winter, the juveniles are shunted from the area around the nest. They remain on the territory, but presumably it's because adults don't want any extra activity around the nest, because it really kind of alerts potential predators to the nest. And so they effectively ignore that juvenile until its younger siblings have fledged the nest, and sometimes the juvenile will come back and feed its younger siblings in April and May. The other two individuals, 2 or 3 individuals that are ejected, sometimes they ended up on being adopted by adults that didn't have a successful nest. Very rarely they end up breeding. And mostly we presume that they've have very high mortality rates. We are starting to do that now. It's track juveniles, both the ones that stay on their territory and the ones that disperse. And we're doing that through radio tracking. We put radio transmitters on the young while they're in the nest, a little bit older than 11 days. And then we both track them from the ground using handheld antennas, but also track them from the air and once or twice in the summer and once or twice in the fall. That gives us an idea of who's died, where they go, where the ejectees end up breeding or being adopted if they're off our regular study site. And this has provided some really interesting insights. And my current PhD student, Matt Fierst, is leading this project on dispersal. So that brings us around back to the caching period in the late summer and fall. And that's basically my quick overview of the ecology of Canada jays. And I want to take just the last part of this talk quickly to talk about the causes of decline of jays in Algonquin. And they have declined by quite a bit since the early 1980s. Over 50% of the territories that we've traditionally monitored have declined. And this graph is about up to 2017, and it's remained fairly steady at a low level since then as well. We wanted to know why they've been declining so much. There wasn't anything obvious to do, but we thought, well, since caching and food caching is such an integral part of jay life and survival and even reproduction, that it could have something to do with cached food. So Dan, many years ago, proposed this hypothesis, the hoard rod, and that proposes that declines are caused by warmer fall temperatures that spoil cached food. It's kind of a compelling argument because the higher temperatures would really prevent jays from freezing that food as early as possible because the food is all perishable. If it was nuts, it would be a different story. But meat you want to preserve as quickly as possible, and berries and insects and so on. If the temperatures rise, that food could spoil, and then you end up with very little food come winter, and also when you want to start breeding. So the two questions we asked was, is cache food influenced by temperature or something related to temperature? And does this thing that might influence cache food also influence reproductive success and survival? So to answer the first question, we used some simulated caches that Dan made about over 2 decades ago. And those are just simple plastic containers that have an outlet to drain water. And on the inside of the plastic container, we put a piece of bark of the same type that we ended up putting the container on the tree. The piece of food, whether it be mealworms or something else, and then attach it to the tree. And that way we can simulate kind of the way a jay has cached food. And it also allows us to take out the caches anytime, put them in and take them out anytime we want. We can't follow jays where they cache food, very rarely. And so that means that we can't follow actual caches that jays make, but this is kind of the best we can do at the moment. And earlier on, what we found is that conifer trees are better at preserving cached food. This shows a bunch of trees on the x-axis at the bottom and the percent of lost weight, weight that's been lost over 126 days. So deployed in June and retrieved in November. And these are raisins. There's example of mealworms too, but on the right-hand side there's an example after 126 days of what raisins look like on a black spruce and a sugar maple. And it's quite dramatic. And what it suggests is that spruce and conifers are better at preserving cached food, likely, we think, because of their antimicrobial properties in the bark, in the resin. And so jays key on caching food on conifers. They are mostly found in black spruce bogs in Algonquin, and that's where they like to cache their food. To test whether temperatures influence cached food, rather than bringing these things in the lab, which we felt was a little bit too artificial, we wanted to put these, deploy these in different latitudes within the gray jay range and outside the gray jay range as well. So we chose 3 latitudes, Cochrane, Algonquin, and Guelph, which is in Guelph being, of course, outside of the jay range, but a higher temperature than Algonquin. We deployed these on 3 different tree species, and we used mealworms and raisins at those 3 different latitudes for a total of 810 caches. And one of my master's students, Talia Seshley, did this experiment. And the timeline for this experiment looks like this. We deployed them in September. We retrieved the first in November after the first frost. The second batch we retrieved in January, when we know jays are at the height of retrieving their cached food and when there's little fresh food available. And then we retrieved a 3rd batch during the breeding period when most jays are incubating in March. I'm going to show you just one result from that experiment. There are lots of different results. Here we're looking at the freeze-dried mass remaining in the caloric content on 3 different tree species, jack pine, white birch, and black spruce, at 3 different locations. And where their locations represent differences in temperatures. And here are the data, but really all you need to look at here, or what I'll highlight, is that Cochrane, at the northern edge of their range, they're the northernmost site that we used, tended to preserve the caches the best, which we predicted. But what we didn't predict was that Guelph and Algonquin had roughly the same performance. And Guelph is quite a bit warmer than Algonquin outside of the gray jay range. So this was difficult for us to explain. If Guelph preserved food as well as Algonquin, why aren't jays further south? So this kind of prompted us to look at other things that might be related to cache food preservation, other environmental variables. And one of those was freeze-thaw cycles. This is a profile of a freeze-thaw cycle in Algonquin for 1 year, from October to February. And you can see how many times the temperature, both the max and the min, go below and then above zero. And you can imagine that this might be detrimental for jay food as well. If you take some meat out of the freezer in the morning for your dinner later on that day, and you decide you don't want it, you put it back in the freezer again, and you do that maybe for 3 days in a row because you're really indecisive of what you want for dinner, that can be detrimental for your food. It breaks the cells in the food, and it causes microbes to be able to easier access the food, and really contributes to rot. So we did another experiment on this time at a single location, but this time on a lot of caches on a single tree, as you can see, with replicates. And we took them out every 3 days this time to look at how freeze-thaw cycles through freeze-thaw events influence the cache food. We did this on blueberries and chicken meat. And sure enough, the cumulative freeze-thaw events was the best predictor of mass loss in the food, which above and beyond temperature, which suggested maybe that freeze-thaw events were the thing, or were the key to try to understand declines in jays and how it might influence survival reproductive success. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. The short story for survival is we found no evidence that either temperature or freeze-thaw events in the fall influenced jay survival. But we did find that freeze-thaw events influenced both the brood size, so how many young were in the nest, as well as overall nest success, particularly for late nesters. Early jays that nested early in the season seemed fine. They didn't seem affected by freeze-thaw events. But Canada jays that nested later in the season, they were quite influenced by freeze-thaw events, such that the more freeze-thaw events in the previous fall, the lower nest success they had. And the absolute kind of kicker to this, and something that we haven't published quite yet, is that weather variables in the fall, during the fall caching period, are the thing that drive the growth or decline of the Algonquin jay population. And here what I have is weather variables at different periods of the year on the x-axis and their effect on population growth rate. So a population can grow if it's a positive number, or decline if it's a negative number. And fall caching has a negative effect, or fall weather during the fall caching period can have a negative effect on population growth rate, which we think is a contributor, or a major contributor, to declines in the Algonquin population. So I hope through this short talk that I've kind of convinced you, or contributed to convincing you, the value of long-term studies and understanding this. Much of what we know is a culmination of knowledge over many decades. And this, we really started not knowing anything about this species. It takes many years to track individuals. Jays can live for up to 15 years. To try to understand what influences their success over their lifetime really requires decades of study. And this is really one of the few examples now that in which we know the mechanisms by which climate change can influence a population. We have lots of correlations between high temperatures and abundance, but there's very few cases where we know how temperatures or climate influence abundance directly. And part of that is through understanding how jays live throughout the year, in the fall, in the winter, in the spring and summer, and how those seasons are connected, and how what happens in one season can influence things that happen in later seasons, like for example, fall climate influencing reproductive success in the late winter. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. We are working on tracking jays in Algonquin right now. We're interested in how they're doing in other parts of their range, of course, and we have expanded our study sites. Dan Strickland has been working on Vancouver Island for several years, and we've been collaborating with people in Alaska to try to understand how jays deal with more northern climates. And there have been a lot of grad students involved in this project, and a lot of field assistants. that have all contributed to these studies that I presented today. Lots of funding sources, especially NSERC, since I've been involved, and Friends of Algonquin Park as well. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Ryan. That was really fascinating. If anyone has questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And we'll read them out to Ryan that way. Before we do questions, I'm just going to quickly turn it over to Janet, who has a few closing remarks in case anyone has to leave us.
Thank you, Ryan. That was very, very interesting. You've given us lots to think about for sure. We're going to take your questions in just a moment, but I just wanted to thank you all for coming out today. I see that there are many repeat visitors to our session, so we thank you very much for continuing in our series. I hope you're all getting out into nature. This summer has been a wonderful time to really get out and just improve our quality of life during this crazy period we're in. Just to let you know, our green properties are all open now, and that means that we are still under the advisement of Canada Health, and we have COVID signs there that you must all make sure you're aware of and abide by the current social distancing and crowd size. We know this is an unusual time for everybody, and the demand on your resources is unprecedented, but our work continues. Our team has been in the field all summer, executing property management programs, inventorying species at risk, installing new Motus towers, and identifying future properties for consideration. So we just need you to help us in the future. If you could please consider putting us on your donation list and supporting us. We all know how special this place is, and we really want to keep it as beautiful and pristine as it is now forever. So thank you for what you can do to support us. Our next Landmark Speaker Series is next Saturday, and it's a special talk on turtles. Dr. Pat Chow-Fraser will be back, and she's asking if your kids could please send in questions to gblt.org/landmark, and she will address all of those questions individually and get back to your kids. So if you could do that in the next day or so, that would be appreciated, so we can make sure that Pat is able to answer all your questions. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy this glorious day wherever you are, and I'll turn it back to Ryan and Sarah.
Thanks, Janet. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. Ryan, first, Stephen's wondering, how do adults react to the infiltration of their nests while you're checking their young?
It varies by individual jay, actually. They really have kind of distinct personalities. So the ones on the bolder end will, they'll be kind of right above, swooping down, maybe vocalizing a little bit. We've even had, and I should have shown this video, we've even had, while we've been measuring young, I had a grad student measuring a nestling, had the nestling in a hand, and the parent come and feed it while the nestling was in the hand. Other jays that are a little less bold or aggressive might just take off and come back once the nestlings are in the nest.
All right, and Brooks is wondering, are jays effective at rejecting their spoiled cached food?
That's a question I'd love to know, and we don't. One of the things that is really difficult in studying jays, there are many things that make it easier, but we really can't follow jays to a cache or follow them to retrieve a cache, just because they're all over the territory in places we don't know, and of course following a bird in a forest is difficult. Your line of sight is not very far, so we don't really know. Those are some of the really interesting questions about caching. Do they retrieve food based on how fast they spoil? Do they know that? So for example, maybe they, retrieve meat earlier than they might retrieve an insect or something like that. All questions that we'd love to be able to answer, but not sure how to answer them.
Okay. Question from Jeff. What is the ideal fall climate? And do you think Georgian Bay will ever see Canada jays?
Well, the ideal fall climate for a jay would be a kind of an earlier onset of winter, I think, and a consistent, once that winter sets in, is below freezing temperatures that don't go above to potentially thaw out food that's already been cached. Whether we'll see jays in Georgian Bay, no, unlikely. We don't see them now, and with warming, we probably won't see them. That's partly due to, even though there are parts of Georgian Bay at the same latitude of Algonquin, is the warming effect of the water has slightly milder temperatures in the fall, so it's probably just not suitable for jays.
Okay. And Betsy is wondering how you tell the difference between female and male Canada jays, and also do they ever hang around with blue jays?
Well, size is the best way for us to, in the hand, tell a male from a female. We can't really tell size just by sight, just by seeing them. But once we have those certain set of measurements we've done, it's fairly easy to tell. And then, of course, any behavioral cues, females incubate on nests and males don't. So that's the surefire way to tell. The second question was,
do they ever hang around with blue jays?
Yeah. Well, no, it's more blue jays hang around with gray jay, or Canada jays, I should say. If blue jays are episodic in Algonquin Park. Some years they're quite abundant, and other years they're not. When they are abundant, one or more blue jays tend to glom on to a Canada jay pair, follow them around, and steal their caches. Blue jays don't rely on caches like Canada jays do during the winter. How blue jays survive, other than trying to steal cache food from Canada jays, is a bit of a mystery. Just because they're just not as smart as Canada jays.
Okay. Stephen is wondering, are caches set on the side of trees where there's less sun, or is it random?
That's a great question. That's something also we've talked about trying to look at, and you would hypothesize that they should be set on the north side of trees to increase freezing, the probability of freezing. When we can give food to Canada jays, as I mentioned, but then tracking down where they cache it is often difficult. I would say 90-95% of the time we really don't know where they exactly went to cache that food. But it would be possible, it would be a study to do that would be possible. I think we probably could get enough to look at orientation. So that would be an interesting project.
And Ruth is wondering, she says she lived on Georgian Bay 30 years ago and they had plenty of jays then. So she's wondering what happened to them that we don't have them now.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know the numbers offhand. It maybe doesn't surprise me that there were jays in Georgian Bay during that period, and they've likely just declined to a point where there's none left because of warming. I mean, we knew that jays were more abundant south of the park decades ago. But what we're seeing right now is just a constriction of the southern end of the range. Where that will stop, we don't know. I mean, we may see no jays in Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury in 30 years. It's entirely possible.
Okay, that's all the questions we have in the chat. So I think we'll wrap up now. Thank you so much. That was such a great talk. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.